welcome to our February Kohn Lecture. Today we have Tosan presenting first. He is a senior majoring in finance. Please welcome him.
Alright. Hello everybody, my name is Tosan Obatoyinbo. I'm a senior here at the University of Rochester. I'm also a speaking fellow and a finance major. And today I'll be talking about conversational leverage and the insignificance, yes, the insignificance of dialogue in creating opportunity. Now I'll be going deeper into explaining how there are many underlying factors into what goes on underneath dialogue that actually opens doors to opportunities. So if you look further to the right, you're going to see a couple familiar faces of MLK, of Winfrey, and the like. So, and you notice that not only are they top key leaders, or they were key leaders in their designated fields, but you also notice that they were impeccable speakers. But is this a coincidence? I believe not. Apart from being amazing speakers, they all share certain key characteristics, and some of which include having a great self-understanding, being strategically positioned in order to achieve their goals, having a strong mindset with fortitude, and they all use this not only to create opportunity that opens doors for themselves, but their followers, and effectively makes them great at leverage. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, but studies have shown in multiple cases that there are multiple things that do factor into dialogue, which are deeper than just the speech itself. The most prominent of which is the Carl Walls and Walter Weiss experiment that took place in the mid-1950s. This experiment paired 20 graduate high-performing graduate students with 20 listeners, and the graduate students were made to express why they want to accomplish their postgraduate goals after they leave the school. They were paired with also 20 listeners who were listening to their reasoning, and they were also meant to explain after to Carl and Weiss and why they thought they had accomplished their goals. Out of the 40% of 20 listeners, 40% reported that they did feel that these speakers would accomplish their goals post-graduation due to the fact that they felt that they expressed alignment between themselves and their goals. So in other words, they had a good sense of self-understanding of what they wanted and how they were going to achieve their goals. 35% of the listeners indicated that they felt that speakers had good resources both internally within the school and externally in order and put them in a good position to achieve their goals. And 20% of the set reported that they felt that the speakers had an overall strong mindset and a great sense of fortitude that enabled them to achieve their goals. And a mere 5% reported that they simply felt that they were able to accomplish their goals because of the speech in which they gave off, that they were able to articulate the goals clearly. But if dialogue is only 5% of really what opens doors, what truly creates leverage that allows you to create opportunities? Let's start with 40%. Owning your own narrative. Now, think of it like your own personal resume. Except instead of learning how to get to the goal, you're taking into account the bad in the overall journey. You account for the trials as well as the tribulations. And you take into account someone, you think of a person like Barack Obama. On his road to becoming the president in his first term, he didn't only speak about his overall goals for what he had as planned for the president of the United States, but he also talked about his trials and his tribulations. A couple of which included his struggles with student debt as a lower socioeconomic class student, and also his struggles with paying for affordable health care, and this also created relatability amongst his speakers and also enabled him to create leverage that overall won him the presidential campaign, and was a crucial part of doing so. Also, under self-understanding, an important factor is present awareness. which is a core understanding on why you're doing things on a daily basis to build upon your past narrative and work towards your future goals. A present example of someone who exempts amazing present awareness is Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey tried and strived on a daily basis to become as emotionally authentic as possible, and she did so every day by journaling constantly and introspecting regularly on her interviews. And she did this for the purpose of achieving her overall end goal of uplifting people through her robust social media platform, which she ultimately accomplished. Now, moving on to the 35%, we start with positioning. An important part of positioning is, for one, building your village. It's a popular saying, birds of the same feather flock together. And this is not just because of influence, but it also shapes opportunity in the sense that once you find your people, you're ordered to exude a confidence and a level that reflects in your dialogue and can enable you to unlock different levels of opportunity in life. Moving on, room selection is also key to positioning. Not everywhere deserves your energy. Similarly, there are many instances in which people are in the wrong rooms and are articulating themselves in an environment that is not capable of giving them the opportunity. Take, for example, being at a school like the University of Rochester and majoring in pre-medical studies. There are several top-flight pre-medical students like yourself. You are assisted by strong alumni, and you're also assisted from resources from strong hospital and so on and so forth. Moving on to the 20% is your mindset. An important part of mindset when it comes to unlocking opportunity is having intellectual flexibility. And many times when we're chasing opportunity and succeed in the long term, it often comes at a time we don't expect or not in the way we imagine. This is why it's very important to have a sense of flexibility when it comes to opportunities and problem solving. And this reflects very well when you're pursuing opportunities to dialogue and interact with others who can potentially give you opportunity. Moving along, when it comes to mindset, confidence is a key factor and it's a byproduct of not just a strong mindset but repetition. As mentioned, many key leaders and people who are top of their field in what they did were not just leaders, but they're also great speakers. And this came from the repetition that built confidence in their speech, which is why they're renowned for what they do. So, through following the process of self-understanding, positioning, mindset, and dialogue is the most visible part of how you use your voice to create conversational leverage that builds opportunity. But it's a key side effect of the process of self-understanding, positioning, and mindset. And through this, I have put together a mini dialogue that kind of explains how my alignment can help me create conversational leverage. My name is Tosan Obatoyinbo, and I'm passionate about developing various skill sets that help me impact my community positively. I constantly introspect in order to know myself better. I'm self-aware and present in the moment. I position myself intentionally in various clubs, societies, and organizations which are oriented towards my daily goals. And I lead the strong, fortuitous mindset through acts of fitness, acts of public speaking, through the speaking fellows, as well as acts of community service. All in all, I hope you've learned a thing or two about positioning yourself properly, having a sense of self-understanding, and using mindset in order to create conversational leverage through dialogue. And yeah, thank you. Q&A?
Sorry?
Q&A?
Oh, yeah, I guess we could do it this way, yeah.
Or do you do after everything?
We sometimes do, but in this sense we can do immediate. Why not? We'll do it that way. Mm-hmm. How did you pick this topic? Like, what kind of came to your idea of how you wanted to talk about all these core components?
My reasoning behind the topic was I've gone to a couple conferences this year where people have had to really go and get in front of people and talk and sell themselves as an individual. And I noticed that the people who sold themselves the best weren't just, I guess, saying words or talking about the experiences, but it was clear that through what they were saying, they had a good sense of self-understanding on why they wanted to achieve their goals, their positioning, so they had resources that were able to put them in the situation they wanted to, and they had a strong, consistent mindset which helped them achieve their overall goal. But it all culminated in dialogue and how they talk, and this gave them the leverage to get the opportunities they wanted to. Any more questions?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about self-understanding, which I think is super interesting because we often say to people, know your audience, know who you're speaking to. But this concept of like knowing yourself before you even start to think about your audience is, yes, I've never thought about that before. And so you mentioned it like Oprah with things like journaling and reflections, Obama's strategies of using his own story to connect with people. Do you have any more ideas about how we can build this kind of self-understanding?
One thing I actually wanted to talk about as well was kind of, you could say self-awareness like Oprah and being able to tell your past narrative like Obama. But one other thing I'd say is important in self-understanding is to understand your overall direction. And I think it's important because we have, along a journey of chasing an opportunity, the goalpost is constantly or slightly changing in terms of what we want. So you have to be grounded in your direction, and that's something that's crucial to know about yourself. So I'd say a sense of direction while keeping a flexible mind, like I mentioned, is something important in self-understanding.
That's so interesting, and it can impact everything from like the classes you choose to take, or like other opportunities. Yeah, that's super interesting. I never thought of that.
Yeah, so with positioning, like, the study said it makes up like 35% of like what creates leverage, right? So like, but I think like a lot of these people, like Oprah especially, I think she's the best example, is definitely like talking within her niche. So like, do you think that when you're talking to people outside of your niche, dialogue plays a larger role? Because I think like, for voters who maybe aren't so similar to Obama, he probably had to take different strategies than just trying to be relatable, right? So like knowing yourself matters less to people who are outside of that niche. Like, do you think dialogue takes over then?
That's a very great topic. But I think in terms of relatability in that case, I think you could kind of relate that to directional purpose. So Obama's just trying to do what? He's trying to become the president of the United States, and to do that, he has to relate to the masses. So I think to an extent, you have to really understand yourself and your audience and be relatable. But that's also a very good point in terms of when you're speaking as well, in terms of direction, which I didn't quite talk about but mention. It's important to understand as well, because like you said, not everyone, you're not going to be able to relate to every single person, especially when you're trying to carry out a task like that. So I think it kind of boils down to understanding of self, not in terms of what you are, but in terms of the direction you're going and how you could relate to those people who are not specifically in the same demographic.
Maddi, do you have access to like the Instagram?
Yeah. Oh wait, actually no, I don't. Only the marketing team. Maddi. I'm a junior majoring in microbiology. I want you to imagine that you're a patient, you're sitting in the exam room, you haven't been feeling well, so they've run a bunch of tests, and now you're just waiting for your results. The doctor walks through the door, for now we'll just call it a him for clarity purposes, and he says, "This is what you have." And then he proceeds to say what that means, quick blurb, hands you some flyers, tells you what prescriptions he'll send for you, and then says, "Head out to the front desk and they'll schedule a follow-up appointment." How would that make you feel? Perhaps some of these emotions, maybe uncertain, shock, a little disrespected. I think it could be a lot of these things because not only may you have heard some news that could be life-changing, but it was also delivered in a way that left you feeling unsupported and yeah, basically when I was thinking about this topic, historically, medical education has not focused on communication and the importance of communicating with their patients. And over time, we realized that this is a major area for improvement because with only focus on technical aspects like how to suture and the anatomy of the body, we lose that aspect of connecting to our patients. So with this topic, I also wanted to connect it to everyday life because I realized that there are themes that connect to our personal relationships and communication with those. So I wanted to talk about how breaking news can be done in a way that can either be resulting in trauma or healing, trust versus mistrust, and then also whether a person is able to heal or move forward and how quickly they're able to do so, which is why it can matter how you speak and what you say. So whether it be medicine or everyday life, it matters what you say and perhaps more significantly, how you say it. To provide some background, in medicine we kind of discuss bad news as anything that would negatively alter the patient's youth or future. And what you notice with this statement is it's very patient focused. It's not saying it's cancer, it's terminal, there's no direct labels, which is trying to show that two diagnoses or one diagnosis could mean a whole different things to two different people. So it's important to consider your own biases of what's bad and what's not bad. So you approach each diagnosis with the same importance, so that you aren't making someone feel less supported because you think it's not as serious. In terms of everyday life, I wanted to touch on how it could affect some conversations that may be resolving conflict. So perhaps you got your feelings hurt and you want to talk about how you can move forward. Perhaps you are discussing financial disagreements and you need to come to a resolved situation where both parties can discuss and perhaps there are some more emotions involved as well. But to go over a couple of the consequences that may happen, again, the main one in the medical field is just feeling a little struggling to cope with the illness and not feeling supported due to the way it's delivered. In everyday life, it can also lead to chronic conflicts. When we think about in everyday life, we're also thinking about relationships where we've actually known this person probably for longer, and we probably have a strong sense of care for that person. So it's important to address these different situations with some care and with time, because otherwise you can lead to resentment and emotional distress as well. So what steps can we take to become better communicators in these tough conversations? I wanted to share 5 steps with you that I think would encompass both of these topics. Various studies have found, they have different acronyms, but people can think of it in different ways, but in general you want to think about there's a time to prepare, a time to inquire about the other person's feelings, sharing that perspective, a time for listening and discussing, and then proceeding with next steps. For each step, I will have a focus on both in the medical sense and then also in everyday life. So through a medical lens, we want to think about how we're going to prepare the moment. So think about the space. You want it to be comfortable and quiet. So especially this can be difficult in the emergency department because there's a bunch of noise, but this is especially when you want to try to get to a quiet room if you can. The other thing is you want to provide that ample time. A lot of times when we see people dissatisfied with their care, it's because it seems like the doctor is always in a rush and they're not giving them that time to be heard. So it's important that you allow that time in your schedule to be able to sit down with this person and to hear out their concerns and talk with them for as long as they may need. It is also important to go into the conversation knowing that there will be or may be cultural or religious differences and to be cognizant of that when you're talking to these people. Through an everyday life lens, the same applies, but there, as I mentioned, these relationships are a little bit different, so you also want to consider keeping expectations modest. For example, with me and my mom, I know one conversation isn't going to resolve all the past conflicts we had. So it's important to go into it with realistic expectations and goals so you can keep the conversation on the right track. And then you can also consider what previous conversations you've had with this person to determine maybe what worked, what didn't work. And this can maybe help shape how you may frame things so that the other person is more receptive to what you have to say. The second step is to inquire. At this step, you're trying to gain a level of where the patient is at already. So you can ask, what do you understand about this condition? So you can kind of understand what the patient already knows, what feelings they may have towards it, which can help you build off of where you may be able to fill in the gaps, clarify any misunderstandings, and then also not reiterate things that they already know and probably don't want to hear again. Through an everyday lens, this could look like asking when would be a good time to talk. You want to consider that when both people are super heated, this is not going to be the best time. So you want to think about a time that would work for both people. And the other thing is when you're with them, you might discuss if there's any rules that you want to set, like no shouting, no name calling, things that will kind of keep it from getting too disruptive. When you're sharing, the biggest thing is avoiding medical jargon. It can be difficult for translating between what the report says and what you should say to the other person. But this is where it's the key part, because with too many terms, the other person is going to tune out the information, and it's important that the other person can understand. Here, this is important where you're able to deliver that news with honesty, but then also being sure that you're empathetic as well. And then here as well is where you can teach where those gaps that you noticed when you inquired about where they're at to start filling those in. In this aspect, we want to be clear without being accusatory, because once we get to that accusatory point is when we often find ourselves becoming defensive, which can be a little difficult in moving with the conversation. Step 4 is listen and discuss. It can be tempting to, after you say something negative and you see their facial expressions, you might think to fill the gap real quick, just be like, it's going to be okay, or we'll do this, or what are your questions? But this is important to offer that time for silence. Let that person process, take in that information, and then reply when they are ready. Some suggest if it's been an extreme amount of time and they're just silent, this could be a good time to check in and be like, how does this make you feel? But you do want to give that time where they can think for themselves and also just kind of wait in the process. The same applies here, and a lot of times I was finding is, and you might have heard before, is to use I statements. So, I feel. And then here is the important part of remembering not to say I feel before you statements, which is what can happen sometimes as well. But here we also just want to remain calm and then try to keep an open mind, since a lot of times when there's disagreements, there are two sides, and then there is probably also not a correct side or someone who's entirely correct. So just going into it with an open mind is always. And then the next steps involve summarizing the discussion, And then making sure they don't feel abandoned. So making sure that if they do have more questions in the future, which is likely the case, they get to think about it, look it up, talk to more family members, and then just letting them know that you are there as a resource. And then same applies here. This is where you might decide that you guys have come to an agreement, maybe you agree to disagree, or maybe you both feel like you need to have more conversations. But at some point, whether you decide there should be an ending to it or it's a good stopping point, it's a good time to wrap it up and express some reflection as well. As a recap, these were the 5 steps I talked about. Prayer in the moment, inquiring about the other person's feelings, sharing with honesty and empathy, listening and discussing, and then proceeding with next steps. While I know a lot of us will probably not ever have to give bad news to a patient, I can say that all of us will likely have to have a tough conversation with someone we care about at some point in our lives. So I hope some of these aspects in any of these steps may be able to assist you to be clear and feel heard while remaining truthful and kind. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I think this is kind of with medicine, and once you started talking, I kind of remembered in my sophomore year I was really, really sick. This was in the middle of winter, and I was going some tests running on UHS, and they said I should not, like, just in case it's bad, I shouldn't bother coming back, and then they send something through an email. So given the rise in AI, and given that the 5-step process is a very great system in order to make delivering bad news less, painful or less nerve-wracking. Given the rise in AI and a lot of these pieces of bad news being delivered in forms of email, how do you think this would change the scape of bad news when it comes to medicine, and just what's your take on it in general?
That's a great point. I think this is also where we need some systemic change as well, where right now a lot of the time is spent with documenting, and also if you notice when you go in, there's so many steps of you speak to the nurse, you speak to the PA, you speak to a specialist, and then you speak to the doctor, and it can be very confusing for people, even when I'm the patient, but I think it's important to consider that, one, it's going, for time's sake and just the amount of people, there will be some updates through the message, like, oh, your test it's positive or negative. But I think the key thing to remember is when you're trying to figure out, let's say, your treatment plan, nowadays with cancer treatments especially, it can be very personalized, and that's where especially those conversations, those appointments need to be an hour or more. They need to be able to sit down and tell them, these are all the options you have, and let them think about it and also decide for their own, instead of feeling pressured one way or the other, or that this is their only way to go forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I really, really love these steps, and it does help me think about delivering bad news. So my question is, what if you're on the receiving end of bad news? How do you ask, whether it's a medical professional or someone you know, how do you maybe ask them to put some of these steps into place? Like what's something you could do to advocate for yourself?
I think I'll address them separately. I'll start with on the personal level. I think this could be a good time where if you get bombarded with news and you don't think you're mentally ready to speak about it, I think this could be a good time to say, thank you for letting me know. I'd like to think about it for a little bit, and can we talk later? I think this is a good time that allows you to also think about how you want to address the situation, and also so that you can present how you would like to, and then also meet the other person where they're at as well. So being cognizant of all the different variables and being able to deliver a conversation that will actually meet both people at what they want to get out of that conversation. Regarding if you are in that patient situation, I think it would be helpful to ask the questions, even if you feel like it can be difficult, and also just to assume that there are no bad questions, then hope that the provider will be able to answer those for you, even saying, can you clarify what this means perhaps? there will be occasionally providers who will not be good at communicating, and this is also a time where you may even consider reaching out for a second opinion, or even seeking perhaps a friend who may be in the medical field who may be able to help explain things a bit more. But I think in terms of asking for them to stay more engaged, I think just saying that, like, I don't feel supported here, or I'd like to feel more supported here. I feel like a lot of times doctors want the best for the patients, and part of the times where they have that fear of these conversations is because, one, they don't know, but then also they're afraid of how the other person's going to react, and they don't want to hurt them at the end of the day. So I think for them, having that perspective of what would help them most would be very helpful.
I was pretty interested in your step 2 of like inquiry, because like I've been annoyed a lot in the past from like people, you know, like repeating like redundancies and like things I already know. And I get that that's annoying, but like at the same time I'm thinking like, you know, if you know you're a doctor and you pose like almost like a rhetorical like, what do you know about X condition that I just said you have, it might come off as like, you know, like just tell me what it is. So you might get a negative reaction from that too. So I guess like what I'm asking is like, is probing someone like something that you can actually prepare for, or is like that you can go back to step 1 for, or is that maybe something that you kind of might want to just gauge on the fly?
I think you can do both. I think depending on if this is a repeated patient, you already have a better sense of their history. But if you're seeing them for the first time, I think not using the word no and using the word what do you understand can help them say, oh, I think it's bad, or I think it's good. This might invoke different things rather than just like, tell me the textbook definition of whatever this illness is. I think that is still important to ask, because you can kind of gain a sense. You probably will still explain exactly like what you need to, but it kind of still helps you get a sense of where they're currently at mentally, whether like it's not positive, but whether it's like very negative or if it's more neutral. And I think that can be very helpful with how you address it. And then obviously as you're speaking to them, you can monitor their facial expressions and body language. And especially if you see them starting to withdraw, that's when you can take a pause, say like, would you like a break? Would you like some water? Offer some tissues. There's physical cues you can look at as well. But I think it's still important to ask what they understand about a certain thing, and also if they would prefer to receive all the information at once, or as much detail as possible, or little by little.
And especially with like medical misinformation as well. Like I was also thinking about inquiry. Yeah. So it is, in some ways it feels even more urgent to say to someone like, where are we? What kind of knowledge is in this room? What kind of things?
Thank you.
Thank you.